Hello and welcome to the Dailies. Today, Iran leads the global front pages, with protests spreading nationwide, a deadly crackdown and also a growing battle over information. But it's not the only story driving headlines. In Washington, Trump faces fresh political storms, from backlash over the Department of Justice probe targeting Fed Chair Jerome Powell to a new crisis around ICE after the Minneapolis and Portland shootings. And finally, even Hollywood makes the news, with Golden Globes slammed as flat, predictable, and running out of energy. We'll start with Iran, as global media continue to focus on the widespread protests, framing them as a nationwide revolt facing an increasingly deadly crackdown. A major focus was Iran's internet shutdown, with Starlink emerging as a key lifeline and even reportedly being jammed and disrupted. Coverage also centered on the international angle, especially Trump weighing options and fears of escalation. The Wall Street Journal reported in an exclusive that the Trump administration is now stepping up planning for possible action in Iran, with senior aides preparing to brief the president on Tuesday. The report says options on the table include new sanctions, covert cyber operations, boosting anti-regime messaging online, and even potential military strikes. The piece also notes that officials warn that any U.S. move could backfire by feeding Tehran's claims of foreign interference or raising expectations among protesters. It also highlights the Pentagon hasn't positioned forces yet, suggesting decisions are still early stage. The Economist focused on the dilemma President Trump has created by promising to rescue Iranian protesters without a clear or safe path to do it. The analysis lays out Washington's limited menu of options: symbolic strikes, for example, or wider attacks on IRGC, leadership decapitation, or even non-military tools like Starlink, cyber operations, and tougher sanctions. The piece also carries a blunt warning that each option could indeed backfire, boosting regime propaganda and escalating retaliation against U.S. bases and also Israel, or even helping the IRGC consolidate power if the state collapses. The piece concludes that America's options in Iran are all a high-stakes gamble with no clean outcome. Foreign policy, on the other hand, argues Iran's latest unrest could be the regime's most dangerous test yet, driven not just by politics, but by a currency collapse that has shattered the daily life. The analysis contends that the plunge of the rial and fears over removing a preferential exchange rate sparked strikes in Tehran's bazaars, and then that spread nationwide. The piece describes a country hit by inflation, blackouts, and water shortages, with security forces preparing to escalate. Still, it cautions that collapse isn't guaranteed. Elites may hold, and the opposition remains divided. Ishan Tharoor wrote in the Washington Post, saying Iran's latest protests feel like past uprisings, but with a key difference: the regime's legitimacy looks more eroded than ever. Tharoor explains that demonstrations have spread nationwide, sparked by economic anger, and quickly turned into open calls for regime change, including pro-monarchy symbolism. The piece also argues that Tehran is also weakened externally after setbacks to its regional proxies and Israeli strikes exposing security gaps. The article concludes with Trump hinting at tougher action. Analysts warn collapse is possible, but outcomes remain uncertain. The Times reported that the UK is moving closer to banning Iran's Revolutionary Guard as Tehran's crackdown on protests turns increasingly deadly. The report highlights statements by Transport Secretary Heidi Alexander saying gaps in legislation make it harder to proscribe a state-backed force like the Revolutionary Guard than domestic groups. prompting ministers to explore new legal tools. The piece also underscores long-standing security concerns and alleged IRGC-linked plots inside Britain, and notes also that allies like the US, Canada and Sweden have already designated the group a terrorist organization. The Times of Israel highlights how Starlink has become one of the last remaining lifelines for information leaving Iran after the regime cut off internet and phone networks nationwide. The report explains how protesters are unable to post videos or testimonies through normal channels. Starlink terminals, illegal but now also widespread, are reportedly enabling footage to reach the outside world. But the piece also warns Iran may be actively jamming Starlink, causing severe data losses in some areas and also making connections unreliable. It also stresses that the risks for users are possession, or they are quite high because possession can be treated as collaboration with foreign enemies, potentially leading to arrest or even execution. Israel Hayom profiles Reza Pahlavi, the exiled son of Iran's last Shah, portraying him as a central opposition figure attempting to channel Iran's current protests into regime change. The profile traces Pahlavi's royal upbringing in Tehran, his departure to the United States for Air Force training in 1978, and the monarchy's collapse in 1979. It also explains that after his father's death in 1980, Pahlavi retained the title of Crown Prince while living in exile. The piece highlights his intensified social media activity, his 2023 visit to Israel, and his calls for a democratic, secular Iran, positioning him as a pro-Israel, pro-Trump symbol of alternative leadership. Nadaf Eyal argues in Yediot Ahronot that Iran's protests, despite shocking evidence of mass killing, have not yet reached the conditions for a true revolution. He says that revolutions are rare because they require two missing elements: security forces refusing orders to repress, and also an organized opposition capable of turning street anger into governing power. The author also notes that in Iran, the regime can still command lethal force and no disciplined alternative leadership exists. Eyal also warns that the more realistic risk is an internal coup that replaces clerical rule with military rule. He also adds that limited U.S. strikes may inspire protesters, but could also trigger Iranian retaliation, especially against Israel. Other stories also grabbed media attention in the U.S., such as the backlash from lawmakers after the Department of Justice opens probe into Fed Chair Jerome Powell. Politico explains how the probe triggered an immediate political backlash, with lawmakers warning it crosses a red line on central bank independence. The piece highlights Powell's claims that the investigation is not really about renovations, but pressure over interest rates. It also cites Republican Senator Tom Tillis, who called it proof the administration is trying to politicize the Federal Reserve, and also threatened to block future Fed nominees until the matter is resolved. The piece also underscores how even some House Republicans voiced shock, warning the move could backfire on markets and credibility. Politico magazine offers a blunt warning. After the Minneapolis killing and Portland shooting, ICE is facing a crisis largely of its own making. In a Q&A, former acting ICE Director John Sadwick says the agency has been pushed into hyper-visible, highly politicized street operations at unprecedented speed. a recipe for escalation, he says, for mistakes and also for public mistrust. He criticizes the Department of Homeland Security for rushing to label the Minneapolis incident domestic terrorism before facts were verified, arguing it damaged confidence in any investigation. The piece concludes with Sadwick's simple prescription: de-escalate, lower ISIS profile, stop publicly advertising raids, rebuild ties with local police, or expect more flashpoints. And as media outlets rushed to cover the 2026 Golden Globes, Page 6 argues this year's Globes became a snooze almost immediately, saying that the show felt lifeless and overly predictable despite a strong host performance. The piece praises Nikki Glaser's sharp opening monologue, including edgy celebrity digs, but says that the ceremony quickly flatlined once the awards began. Also, the piece describes winners as tired, the music choices as bizarre, and the podcast as weighed down by filler. Overall, the piece portrayed this year's Golden Globes as dull night, but with a funny host and an award season that felt or feels exhausted. That's it from us today. Thanks for watching the Dailies, only on Al Arabiya English.